Whenever I need inspiration for crafting, I always like to look on the Kirkland's website. Today I've picked out 5 things that I really like from Kirkland's, and I'm going to recreate them using items from the Dollar Tree and the thrift store. Hey everyone, thanks for coming to hang out with me today. If you're new here, my name's Jess. I'm excited to show you these crafts. I hope you're excited too. Let's get started. This planter really caught my eye, and I knew I only needed a few things from the Dollar Tree to recreate it. I grabbed one planter from the Dollar Tree, and I also grabbed 2 of these luau or hula skirts that I found in the summer section. I started by taping one end of the skirt down on my work surface, and you can see that there's about 4 strings per knot at the top of each string. So they knotted some of this raffia type material around the rope, and I just sectioned off 3 of them, and I started braiding down the length of the luau skirt. I went the whole way across the skirt. I wasn't sure if I needed 1 skirt or 2 skirts, but as it turned out, my planter was pretty large, so I did need 2 of the skirts for this project. I started by grabbing 3 sections of the luau skirt, and I just started doing a simple 3-strand braid until I got to the end. When I was at the end, I just secured it with some clear tape, and I did go across the whole skirt doing this. By the time I got to the end of my skirt, there was only 1 section of the raffia type material left, so that worked out perfectly. Because this is a plastic planter, I wanted to rough up the surface a bit before I started adding my braids to it. I'm just using a regular sanding block here, and I'm just taking it over the surface just to take the shine off and to give it a bit of grip so that my hot glue will stick better. I'm using a piece of clear tape again at the top of my braid just to hold the strands in place so that when I cut it off of the rope, they don't fray everywhere. And because my planter is kind of large, this braid didn't fit the whole way around it, and that was okay. I knew I would be able to cover it up later. I started at the bottom. I added a dab of hot glue, glued one end of my braid down, and then I added dabs here and there. I didn't put a whole line down because I didn't want a lot of the glue to seep through the braid. Once I got to the other end, then I secured that end down, and you can see that there is a big gap between the 2 ends, but like I said, I'm going to cover that up later. I continued laying the braids down until I reached the top of my container, and my last braid just went slightly above the container, which was okay because I did want to hide the top of the container so you couldn't see much of that gray color. And that's another tip I have. When I was picking out my container, I tried to pick a color that even if you saw some of the container between the braids, it wouldn't be very noticeable. Like if I would have picked a bright blue container, you probably would have noticed it more than the little bit of gray sticking out between the braids. Now, to fill in the gap where the ends of my braids didn't quite meet each other, I'm taking the same braids, but I'm running them vertically along the planter. So on the ends of the planter where they're taped together, you can see because they're pinched, there's a lot of gray showing. So I started my first braid about 1.5 inches over from the one end. I hot glued it to the top. I held it in place with a clip, ran a little more hot glue, and then I glued the bottom down. Because these braids were a nice length, I was actually able to get 2 vertical rows out of each braid. On the bottom of the planter, when I secured it with some hot glue, I just made sure that I held it in place and flattened it out with my silicone spatula, just so that it wouldn't be bulky on one side. And the clips really came in handy to hold the top of the braids in place while I was working towards the bottom. And I did the same thing. I just repeated the same process, taping the top of the braid before I cut it, and then laying the braids vertically along the planter. So I guess depending on what size planter you have, you probably could have reached the braids the whole way around horizontally on the planter if you had a smaller one. Or if you really like the look of the vertical braids, you could have laid the braids vertical the whole way around the container as well. It's really up to you depending on what your taste is. I kind of like that they go in 2 different directions. I think it gives it a little more character and a little more interest than the Kirkland's version. I I like the simplicity of this framed print from Kirkland's, and I knew with a few items I could give it more character and more texture. I found this really large frame at the thrift store. This measures about 16 inches by 26 inches. I liked that it has an inset in the middle and there was no glass for me to deal with. I started by giving that inset portion a thick coat of green chalk paint. While that was drying, I grabbed a pack of these giant craft sticks and a pack of the super jumbo craft sticks. Both of these I get at Walmart. You can see the size difference here, and both of them are much larger than the typical tongue depressor size craft stick. If you're using a smaller frame, you could definitely use some of the smaller craft sticks to get the same look, but because my frame was pretty large, I stuck with the bigger craft sticks. I also laid my cutting mat out, and I laid a piece of blue tape where the width of my frame would be. So that would give me a guide as I'm laying out my craft sticks about how big the surface was that I had to work with. I started with the giant craft sticks first. These are the bigger of the two craft sticks, and I always like to use my paper trimmer anytime I'm cutting down craft sticks because it just gives me the most even cut. I really can't give you many measurements here because depending on what size frame you use, you'll have to use your judgment as to what size you need to cut your craft sticks down to. I started with the largest ones. I cut a bunch of them, and I started laying my craft sticks down under my paper trimmer on the surface that I had taped out. If you don't have a big cutting mat like I do, you could just measure out the surface you're working with and lay out a little box using some painter's tape just so you have an idea of how many sticks you're actually going to need to cut down. And then that way you're not gluing them as you're cutting them, so you can play around with the layout. I use the Kirkland's photo as my inspiration for most of the layout. I did have to add in a bit at the bottom. So once I had some of my craft sticks cut, then I started laying them out on my craft mat there, giving me an idea of how many sticks I would need and what lengths I would need to cut them to. And because they were down there on my work surface, I was able to just cut a few sticks at a time, work on the layout as I liked it, go back, use my paper trimmer, cut a bit more craft sticks, and it gave me a better idea of the spacing that I would need for each section of my craft sticks. And I did try to, as I was working through the different sections of the craft sticks, I tried to make sure that they were going in different directions, and I was using both sizes of craft sticks so that I wouldn't have all of the big ones on one side and all of the small ones on one side. It kind of gave it more character and more texture the more that I variated the sizes and the directions of the craft sticks. Once I had the pattern all laid out how I liked it, then I went through with some white chalk paint and I just dry brushed all over the surface of each of the craft sticks. I didn't mind if a little paint got on my cutting mat, so it was easier to do it this way, just to pick up each stick individually, do my dry brushing, and lay it back down where it belonged. That way I didn't lose where my pattern was going to be. If you're worried about getting paint on whatever surface you're using, I would just lay out your pattern how you like it and then take a picture of it so that you can refer back to it so that you know where you need to lay each stick on your picture frame. Now that all of my sticks have been cut and dry brushed, I could reassemble my photo frame. I started by gathering up each pile of sticks according to size, and I laid the pile of sticks down on my surface in the direction that they needed to go. Once all of my sticks were laid back down in their pattern, then I started using some hot glue to glue everything in place. For each group of sticks, I would start at one end, hot glue that end stick down first, then I would move to the other end of the group and glue that stick in place. Then the sticks that were in the middle of the group, I would glue down from each end working towards the middle. That way I could adjust the gaps of the sticks as I was working towards the middle. I didn't mind if the gaps weren't exactly the same throughout the sticks because I did like that there would be a little more green showing through some of the sticks, and it did give it more texture that way. I really like how this piece turned out. I'm always looking for ways to create bigger pieces of decor. Sometimes I think, you know, as crafters, we kind of get stuck in a rut where we feel like we're making the same things over and over again. So it was really fun for me to go to the thrift store and find this frame. It was perfect for what I needed it for, and I'm really glad to have a nice big piece of home decor in my home now. always on the lookout for new risers to use to display some of my crafts. I grabbed one of these garden dishes from the Dollar Tree, and I originally had grabbed these clear bowls that come in a 2-pack, but then when I was at the thrift store, I found this really interesting bowl. It's not real wood, I don't think. It was only $2. It had some neat designs around the outside, which kind of fit my style a little more than just a plain bowl. I flipped both bowls over, and using my sanding block, I'm just roughing up the surface of both of the bottoms of the bowls. Then using a combination of E6000 glue and some hot glue, I just applied that to the bottom bowl and placed my clear dish on top and gave it a good press. Once my glue had a chance to set up, I took everything outside. I am using this black spray paint. It says Rust Performer. It's definitely not necessary for this type of project, but it was the only black spray paint I had on hand, so that's what I'm using. I definitely appreciate that we're having some warmer days here in PA, so I could take this outside and give it a coat of spray paint. I'm sorry, I don't have the best spray painting and camera holding skills. It's kind of out of frame, but you get the picture. I gave this piece 2 coats of the spray paint, and it was ready to be displayed. If you're liking these projects so far, please consider giving this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Also, if you're on social media, I am on Instagram at gluelalacrafts. These faux church windows are such a trend in home decor, and I knew that the Dollar Tree had something similar. The ones from the Dollar Tree are a bit smaller than the Kirkland's one, so I grabbed 2. One I used in a previous project. I also had this flower ring left over that I had pulled some of the flowers off of, and so I'm just going to use the ring part. Now you can see on the one church window, it had some glue and some sticks on it because, like I said, it was from a previous project. So I took the brand new one, and I'm using my miter shears here. These cut through a lot of things. I can cut through dowel rods, and I knew that I would be able to cut through this plastic frame with these miter shears as well. I took the miter shears and I clipped off just the bottom section of the church window. I tried to cut it right above the bar so that I would have something to glue onto the top window. I did have to use my little scraper to remove the piece of glue that was holding the sign on the front, and I had to do the same thing with the previous one as well. Once I had it cut down to the size, I then took my sanding block and I did sand the surface a bit to give it some grip and texture, and I also sanded the bottom of the other window as well. I added a bead of hot glue to the bottom of the full window and added the second piece onto it. Once those were stuck together, I flipped them over and I added more hot glue on the back over the seam of the 2 windows just to make it more secure. Next, I got to work on creating the wreath for the center of the window. I had this ring. It was left over from Christmas time. I think it was meant to go around a candle. I had pulled off some of the flowers that were on it, and I was just left with a few random leaves, so I pulled all those off and then clipped off the extra plastic pieces. Next, I dug through my big bag of loose greenery. I pulled out a bunch of branches. I had these ones, I think they came on a mat, like a mat of greenery, and they had like 4 prongs sticking up from the bottom. So when I cut them in half, they fit over the ring really perfectly. So I cut a bunch of them in half, and I'm just gluing them the whole way around the ring to make them nice and full. Once I had all of those in place, then I added in a few white flowers as well, just to break up some of that green. If you don't have one of these plastic rings from an old candle wreath like I do, you could use just a piece of cardboard. I would just cut a circle out, maybe give it a quick coat of green paint so that if any of it peeks through your greenery, you won't be able to see it. Or you could use an old lid from, say, a cottage cheese container or a butter container, just cut out the center and then do the same thing. Maybe give it a quick coat of green paint just so that if you do see it through some of your greenery or some of your flowers, you won't be able to notice it. To finish off this project, I just needed to hot glue my wreath to the center of my window. Now, the Kirkland's window did have a rope hanger from the top, but this Dollar Tree window actually had a small hook on the back of it, so I didn't need to add the rope to mine. Another trend in home decor that I really like are covered books, and I could not believe how expensive the ones from Kirkland's are. I had this piece of thicker upholstery type material in my stash. I had got it at Joann Fabrics a while ago. It was a remnant piece, so it was really inexpensive. I also had 2 larger hardcover books on hand that I actually use in my home. So I didn't want to hot glue the fabric right to the books because I didn't want to ruin them. If you don't have any hardcover books, you could always find some at the Dollar Tree. The ones at my Dollar Tree were on the smaller side. That's why I didn't pick any up. Or you could look at the thrift store for some larger hardcover books as well. I started by cutting my piece of material down so that I had about 2 inches extra along the top and bottom of the book, and it was wide enough that it could cover the whole book, and I had about 4 to 5 inches that I could fold towards the inside cover of the book as well. Starting along the bottom piece of the material, I added some hot glue in the center and folded up that excess 2 inches. I didn't add glue the whole way out to the ends because I needed the ends to stay open so that I could slip the cover of the book into the ends of the material. I also repeated that along the top, just making sure that it was about the same height as my book. Once my glue was set on the fabric, then I laid the book in the inside of the fabric and folded the ends over and tucked them on either side of the cover. Then I ran some hot glue along just the material so that none of the glue actually got on the book. It was just the material being glued to itself. And I repeated that on both sides of the top and bottom of the book. Once I had the top cover glued in place, I just gave it a little tug so that it would be nice and tight before I flipped the inside part of the bottom of the cover. Like I mentioned though, if you're using a book from the Dollar Tree or a book from the thrift store that you really don't care about, it would be easier just to hot glue the fabric right to the book itself, and then you could tuck the edges in and glue them to the inside cover of the book as well. Now, if you don't have any fabric on hand that you like that you want to cover a book with, another option is to just use some craft paper. I had a roll of craft paper on hand from the Dollar Tree. I cut a piece out about the same as I did on the first book. I left about 2 inches along the top and the bottom and about 4 to 5 inches on each side. I crumpled it up to give it more texture. I just started crumpling it and squeezing it and getting a lot of wrinkles and texture in it, and it does break down the fibers of the paper so that it is a bit easier to work with. Once I had all kinds of wrinkles in it, then I did the same process. I laid my book down, I folded the ends up where I had the excess on each side, making sure that it was about the same height as the book. This time I didn't have to use any hot glue though, because it is paper, it will stay in place. And then once I had the height of the book right, then I just needed to fold the ends in on each side of the cover. And again, no hot glue needed because the paper will just stay in place. I really had a great time recreating these looks from Kirkland's. If you have another store in mind that you'd like to see me do some recreations from, let me know in the comments what store you think I should do next. All right, everyone, have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.